Hello friends, in this video we will be talking about data models. A data model is an abstract model that organizes elements of data in a certain format. That means when the data is stored in the database, it needs to be stored in a certain format or in a particular structure. So data model decides the structure or the method of storing the data in the database. Also, the data in the database is related to one another. Again, it's the job of the data model to define how the data will be related to one another. For example, as you see on the screen, we have a table for the hospital staff, and all the columns have some data about the hospital staff. That means all the data is related to one another and also to the entity, that is hospital staff. Now the data model defines the structure of the data, but it also defines how the DBMS will manage the data in the database. That is, how will the data be stored, accessed or updated. Unstructured data does not have a predefined format, so data models are defined only for structured data. The database design is very much like building a house. Before building a house, we decide our requirement and the basic layout of the house. Then, the architect makes the design, and finally the engineers work to implement the design to build the house. Similarly, in the database, it starts with the users identifying the requirements, that is, what the database is about, what are the attributes, what will be the relationship between the entity and the attributes. Then the database designers and analysts create the database design, and finally the database administrator implements the design using a database management system. There are 4 different types of data models: hierarchical model, network model, relational model and entity relationship model. First, let's see hierarchical model. Hierarchical model organizes data in a tree-like structure, that is in the form of a hierarchy. Within the hierarchy, a higher layer is perceived as the parent of the segment that is immediately beneath it, which is known as the child. The hierarchy starts from the root, expands like a tree, adding child nodes to the lymph nodes. But hierarchical model only had a one-way approach, that is, to get to a certain data, the whole tree had to be traversed, starting from the roots to the nodes. The hierarchical model depicts a set of one-to-one and one-to-many relationships between a parent and its children segments. That is, each parent can have many children, but each child has only one parent. Thus, many-to-one or many-to-many relationships could not be defined, resulting in the drawback of the hierarchical model. This structure is useful in nested sort of information, like for example, table of contents or a recipe chart. Next is the network model. The network model emerged from the hierarchical model to overcome the disadvantages of the hierarchical model. Thus, network model represented complex data relationships much more effectively than the hierarchical model, and hence it improved the database performance. The network model organizes data using 2 fundamental concepts called the records and the sets. The records contain fields and the sets define one-to-many or many-to-one relationships between records. The network model allows a record to have more than one parent. In this model, the data was far more related to each other than in the hierarchical model. This way, accessing the data was far easier and faster, as many-to-one and many-to-many relationships were also established along with one-to-one and one-to-many relationships. Third one is the relational model. This is one of the most important data models. In a relational model, the data is stored in the form of a 2-dimensional table. That is, the data is stored in the form of rows and columns. Now, within the table, the rows and columns are interrelated to each other. This is the most widely used data model, as data storage is very disciplined and accessing of data is far easier. The relational model is implemented through a very sophisticated relational database management system. The purpose of relational model is to provide a declarative method for specifying data and queries. Now, the programming language used for relational model is SQL, and SQL is a declarative language. What is a declarative method or a declarative language? That means it focuses on the computational logic of the programming and not the workflow. That is, it focuses on getting the job done rather than how the job is getting done. In the relational model, the users only need to specify their needs and the rest is left up to the relational database management system. RDBMS hides the complexities of the relational model from the user. The user only needs to specify what data he wants to store, update or retrieve from the database, and then RDBMS will make sure how to maintain the structure of the database while performing all of these operations. A relational diagram is a representation of the relational database's main components. Let's see what are the main components of the relational model. The two-dimensional table in the relational model is called relation. An entity is anything, that is, it can be a person, a place, a thing, or an event about which the data are to be collected and stored. An entity represents a particular type of object in the real world. The columns are called the attributes. They describe the particular characteristics of the entities. For example, an employee entity can be described by employee's first name, last name, his date of birth, address, etc. Rows represent a single record or one particular entry of our data. Rows are called tuples. Now, we cannot just fill any value in any row or any column. We need to define a domain. Domain represents the acceptable or valid values in a particular column. That means name attribute cannot have numbers or the contact attribute cannot have alphabets, but the address attribute has to have both alphabets and numbers. Most relational databases use the SQL, that is structured query language, for programming. Finally, the last one is the entity relationship model. Now, the relational model is based on one single entity. However, entity relationship model defines a relationship among different entities. That means entity relationship model emerges from the combination of relational models. The relational model was far more improved than the hierarchical and the network model. However, it is easier to examine structures graphically than to describe them in text, and entity relationship model allows that. The database designers prefer to use a graphical tool in which entities and their relationships are pictured. Thus, the entity relationship model was defined. That means relational model could describe one entity and its attributes, but entity relationship model has the power to connect different entities as per their relationships and hence draw a graphical representation of those entities along with their relationship and their attributes. This model complements the relational model, and when both are combined, they provide a strong structured database design. Now, entity relationship model is represented by ER diagrams, and to draw the ER diagrams, let's see some of the components that are similar to the relational model and also the symbols that those components carry. Now, rectangles are used to represent entity in the entity relationship model. Now, we know what an entity is. Entity is anything about which data are to be collected and stored. And in the ER diagram, the entities are represented using the rectangles. Then the ellipses. In the entity relationship model, ellipses represent the attributes. And what are the attributes? Attributes are the columns, and they describe the particular characteristics of the entities. To represent an attribute in an ER model, we use the ellipses. Then there are diamonds. The diamonds in ER model represent relationship. That means what is the relationship between the two different entities. Like for example, a doctor entity is related to the hospital entity through his duties. Okay, and a teacher entity can be related to the student's entity through the relationship of teachings. Then the lines represent the relationship. That is, if there is a one-to-one relationship, one-is-to-many relationship, or many-is-to-many relationship, whatever. So lines represent those kinds of relationships. Entity set. An entity set is a collection of similar entities. As you see on the screen, we have two tables. One is the entity doctor and the another is the table of entity department. And we have the attributes like doctor ID, doctor name, doctor department, doctor timings. And similarly, for the department table, we have department ID, department OBD, department contact and department name. Now let's see how to draw the entity relationship model for the same. So the entities doctor and department are represented in the rectangle, and the relationship between doctor and department is duties, and that is represented by a diamond. The attributes for both the entities are represented in the ellipses, and the lines show the relationship between the different entities and their attributes. So that's it for this video. I hope that was helpful. Please share your suggestions in the comment section below, and thank you so much for watching.